joining us today. Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. Hope you'll learn some useful information. As Eleanor noted, I am the clinical director of the Child and Family Counseling Center in Woodbridge. I also am an author of self-help books. I'm a big believer if you teach kids how to deal with some of their challenges as they're young, whether it's anxiety, depression, addiction, getting along with their siblings, making friends, etc. Those are all subjects of some of my books. The more likely you are to prevent problems later on from developing. So, like I said, and I find that it can be very, very useful. All right, let's see. And why is it not advancing? There we go. All right, some of the book, so a lot of the ideas in today's talk will be from my book, What's the Big Deal About Addictions? Answers and Help for Teens. Again, this is addressed to teens themselves to try to give them some factual information on drugs of addiction, on alcohol use, on gaming addictions, smartphone, social media, all that kind of stuff, because all those things can be addictive. And if you don't get those under control when you're younger, again, it can cause all sorts of problems, as you'll learn in this talk. So let me give you an overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. We're going to talk about why people use drugs and alcohol, use or abuse, how we define addiction, how do you tell the difference between casual use and problematic use. I'll give you some statistics about the scope of the problem and what's going on in the country in terms of frequency of use. I'll talk specifically about alcohol use and drug use issues. I'll segue into some behavioral or tech addictions. We'll talk about some risk factors for addictions, like family history, since we know that addictions tend to run in families. And we'll talk about the negative consequences of addictions, how we diagnose them. What do we look for if you bring your child to a therapist to get a diagnosis, see if it actually is a problem. We'll talk some about harm reduction techniques. We're going to talk about treatment options, ways to help teens avoid relapse. We're going to talk a little bit about parental involvement, why it's so important for you as parents to be involved in your teenagers' lives, not only just in general, but also in treatment. Treatment works better if you have the whole family involved. We'll talk some about taking care of yourself so that you don't burn out, because dealing with addictions is extremely challenging, and even the best of circumstances. We'll leave some time for questions at the end, and then there's some resources at the end of the slideshow that you can use if you want to find more information. Also, there's the handout of the slides for the talk. It should be in your chat box. You should be able to click on it and download it. So feel free to do that at any point. All right, this is just a little infographic. This gives you a little bit of kind of ways of thinking about all the different terms that go into thinking about addiction, whether it's steroids, nicotine, dependence, inhalants, crack, acid, etc. And it encompasses quite a few substances and activities. All right. 1 second. And one thing's my computer's slowing down here for a second. Sorry about that. So one of the things we know, again, about these different drugs of abuse is that they are becoming more frequent as kids get more access to them. One of the things we know also about addiction is that because of the legalization of marijuana, we'll talk about the laws in just a little bit, is that it makes kids think that they're safer, okay? So let me start with some case examples. These are just some examples from some of my caseload as well over the years. So Anthony looks forward to hanging out with his lacrosse team. Kicked off the team permanently if they're caught drinking or using drugs. So he feels some tension or a pull between have fun with his friends or take a risk of getting kicked off the team. Tamika enjoys checking out her friends' posts on social media. Instagram and Snapchat are her connections to her friends. However, she finds herself spending more and more time checking her phone to see who's posted and how many people have liked her pictures and posts. She's afraid of missing out. You may have heard of FOMO, fear of missing out. And she even checks her phone in the middle of the night, which causes problems getting up in the morning for school. Adrian spends a lot of his time playing video games. Most of his weekends are spent in front of a screen. His parents complain about how much time he's spending online, but he says it's okay because it's where his friends are and he's just kind of hanging out with them. Uh, Jamal enjoys smoking weed with his friends. He does it mostly on the weekends, and since he doesn't do it every weekend, he figures he doesn't have a problem with it. But lately he started using more during the week, which helps him relax and get to sleep. I'm going to give you one more case example. Jenna started using by experimenting with prescription drugs she found in her parents' medicine cabinet. Vicodin, which is prescribed for pain, seemed kind of interesting, so she decides that she's going to use that with some of her friends. They found out that they liked the high they got off of it, especially when they took more pills than recommended on the bottle. And they liked that feeling so much that they started raiding the medicine cabinets of their other friends and family members. So are these just casual users, or are they addicted? Where to draw the line? This is going back a ways, back into the 1980s. But there's a group, Huey Lewis and the News, and their song was "I Want a New Drug." And I'm just going to read a couple of the lines from the song. It gives you an idea of kind of what people look for in terms of drugs. It says, I want a new drug, one that won't make me sick, one that won't make me crash my car or make me feel 3 feet thick. I want a drug that doesn't hurt my head, won't make my mouth too dry or make my eyes too red, one that won't make me nervous, wondering what to do, one that makes me feel like I feel when I'm with you. So it's a love song, but the way in which he talks about addiction is we're always, humanity in general has looked for drugs, and everybody wants a drug that makes them feel good without any negative side effects, right? That's like the, I guess, Holy Grail. The book from 1987, Craving for Ecstasy, one of the first books I read on addictions way back when. Again, the search for ecstasy is as old as humanity. Whether it's getting drug, we know that ancient civilizations knew how to use drugs to prepare alcohol. They found that smoking plants made them feel good. Sometimes it's used in religious rituals, etc. The problem with this, of course, is that your brain says no such thing. You're not going to find a drug that is perfectly fine, has no side effects, and just makes you feel good. Because one of the things that the brain does is it gets more efficient over time in metabolizing the drugs. And so you may feel good for a while, but then eventually that high fades. And so then you either need more of it to achieve the same effect, or you switch to something even stronger. And that's where people get into trouble in terms of addiction, overdosing, things like that. Here is a view of a typical teenager, multitasking, you can see. He's got his battery pack, he's got his laptop for doing schoolwork, hopefully. He's got his phone charging, he's eating, listening to music, all that kind of stuff. And one of the things we know, and one of the problems with excessive use of electronics, for example, is it really makes it harder to pay attention to things that are more boring, such as the lecture of a teacher, for example. So we think it may be even kind of a culturally induced ADHD in a way, that if you don't practice the skill of being able to focus for longer periods and you're constantly being overstimulated with everything, then when you don't have all that stimulation, it becomes very difficult to stay focused. Okay, so why do people use alcohol or drugs? Obviously, they're using for some good reasons, right? To relax, maybe after a hard day at school or out with friends, to forget about their problems, to reduce anxiety, to sleep better. Marijuana makes a lot of kids find it easier to go to sleep. To be more social. If you're out with your friends and they're all getting high and you're kind of feeling left out, and if you have a little bit of anxiety yourself, if you're getting high with them, maybe your anxiety goes down, you have a good time, and you really enjoy that social interaction. Sometimes it's just to have more fun, just for a new experience. Psychedelics are like that a little bit more, whether it's acid, magic mushrooms, things like that. It's just like a fun activity, like any other. Feeling less depressed. Some people feel less depressed when they're drinking or using drugs. Feeling less angry. We know that marijuana does tend to, in the short term, chill you out. People usually don't commit violent crimes when they're high off of marijuana, for example. One of the problems is that does not last, that eventually what happens, especially if you don't have this marijuana in your system, you rebound. And so you become overly angry when it's wearing off. Having new experiences, that's similar to just having more fun. To be accepted by peers. So this is one of the things as parents you have to be very careful about, that a drug-using peer group generally accepts anybody. And so if your child doesn't have good social skills or is feeling rejected at home or has other struggles socially, and they realize, hey, this group's kind of fun and they accept me, uh, they are at higher risk for developing problems. Boosting creativity. Some people talk about they feel more creative. Their mind is expanded and they feel like they can do some of their best work when they are under the influence. Relieving boredom. So it's a big one. Rebellion. One of the things that attracts some people, especially if you have somebody, for example, with ADHD and they're kind of a thrill seeker type of ADHD, and the rebellion against parental authority or just society in general can be motivating for using. Self-medicating, some of these fall into that category. And the thinking behind that is that you are medicating yourself. You have an issue, whether it's anxiety, depression, ADHD, and you are self-medicating by helping, you're giving yourself drugs or alcohol to deal with an emotional problem. The problem, of course, is that it doesn't last as well, and there are side effects that happen. Being parasuicidal. Parasuicidal basically means that people who are engaging in activities that are very risky, say using fentanyl, for example, which is highly toxic. It's so easy to overdose on fentanyl. But they take their chances because they don't really even care if they live or die. Cutting yourself or engaging in self-injury is another example of parasuicidal behavior. It is things that you're not consciously intending to kill yourself, but you're making it more likely. Driving fast, driving 90 miles an hour on a windy road, and you get into a crash, that's parasuicidal. The person doing that may not be, again, consciously intending to kill themselves, but there is a suicidal aspect of what they're doing. All right, so use, abuse, or addiction. So let me give you some definitions here. So addiction is a compulsive need for a habit-forming substance or activity, okay? This need can be physical, psychological, or both. Now, most users don't become addicted, though it depends on the drug. Some drugs are have a much higher chance of being addicted. For example, if you're using opiates like painkillers, heroin, fentanyl, again, being one, oxycodone, you're much more likely to be addicted on those drugs than you would be on, say, psychedelics or even marijuana. So sometimes people will think that you can't get physically addicted to marijuana, which is not true at all. Because the only way that a drug has its effect on you is for it to change the way in which your brain operates. So it is inherently physical. Psychological, so again, it's a bit of a misleading sort of dichotomy there. The psychological refers more to, okay, maybe you feel like you need it, even though you don't have any physical symptoms of withdrawal if you stop. That's one of the determining factors. If you're on painkillers or if you're drinking excessive amounts of alcohol, you are physically addicted because if you stop suddenly, you go into withdrawal, which can be dangerous with some drugs. Many drugs boost the levels of dopamine. Dopamine is a chemical in your brain that your brain cells basically use to communicate with each other. And when you boost the levels of dopamine, it makes things more rewarding. Okay. One of the ways in which drugs for ADHD work, for example, like Ritalin, Adderall, Vyvanse, Concerta, they boost the levels of dopamine, so it makes boring things more rewarding, which can be good if you're trying to get your schoolwork done, but it's not so good if you're using it for other purposes. And when, excuse me, and when you boost the levels of dopamine, one of the problems is that your brain compensates for it. And so then you have a deficit of dopamine when you don't have the drug in your system. So again, the drugs change how your brain processes information. And a key factor in terms of deciding whether it's a use, abuse, or addiction is that how much impairment is caused by or made worse by the addictive behavior, okay? So technically, if you have a teenager who maybe smokes marijuana, vapes it on the weekends, sometimes with their friends, but their grades are fine, maybe they're still on the sports team, though again, there's a risk if they ever get caught. They still have fun with their friends. Again, grades are good. You're not seeing any problems interacting at home. They pretty much get their stuff done when they're supposed to. That's not technically addiction. It may not be a wise choice for them to be using for other reasons, which we'll talk about in a bit, but it is not an addiction as we define it. So, and it can be caused by or made worse, okay? So if you're already having problems, say, getting along with your parents, and your drug use is making it worse because you're arguing more, you're getting into more trouble, things like that, that's being made worse. If you are struggling academically and your drug use makes it harder for you to do well, and your grades drop even further as a result of your drug use, because you're not going to be in the mood to do your homework if you're high. It's the last thing you probably want to be doing. So let's talk about the scope of the problem here. This is from the Monitoring the Future survey. This is something that is funded by the Centers for Disease Control. And these statistics change from year to year, but this gives you an idea here. So about 13% of eighth graders used alcohol in the last 12 months. Okay. You got about 10% higher percentage in terms of high school students. You got about 10% of eighth graders and 21% of 12th graders vaping nicotine. The perception, of course, is that vaping is less dangerous than smoking an actual cigarette. And we don't really know that for sure because vaping has not been around that long. You are not getting all the chemicals that you get in cigarette smoke. So we think it may be more safe in that respect, maybe lower risk of cancer years down the line. But we really don't know the long-term effects of vaping because when you're vaping, the chemicals that are used to get it to ignite are also being absorbed in your lungs. So we got 3% of eighth graders and 12% of 12th graders using Delta 8 THC. So let me give you just a quick rundown. Delta 8 is a different THC, which is tetrahydrocannabinol. That is the active ingredient in marijuana or cannabis, okay? But they're different chemical formulations. And so what people will do is try to figure out if, since cannabis might be illegal in the state that you're in, for example, but if they use a chemical derivative of THC that is not specifically prohibited, then people can use that. And often you'll see those things sold in like vape shops, even gas stations, as then they're told that people are told that it's safer. But that's not the case because often some of the same problems will happen with these other drugs. About 40% have taken prescription drugs not prescribed for them. So if you're at all concerned about that in your household, keep an eye on your medications, particularly those that have a high likelihood of abuse. Again, the painkillers are particularly prone to that. And a lot of people have them. Maybe you had an injury or an illness or something like that, surgery. And you feel, I don't need this Vicodin. I'll just keep it in the back of a medicine cabinet for later use in case I need it. But kids will go into there. And there's this perception that using prescription drugs are not as dangerous, but they can be just as dangerous if you use them in high enough doses to get high off of them. So about 4,000 young people die from excessive alcohol use each year. And this is tricky as well. And this is a tough parenting choice because what happens often because alcohol is restricted so much among teenagers, it's actually easier to get drugs than it is alcohol for some. So they don't really learn how to moderate their use. And then if they go away to college or they're on their own, where there really isn't much oversight, they go crazy. I just talked to one of my teenage patients who's away at school, and he watched somebody almost die from alcohol poisoning. Thank God he called 911. Otherwise, this person probably would have died because they don't know how to handle it. And if you're playing drinking games, as can be popular in college, again, it's excessive alcohol use. And sometimes what the kids will do because they don't know any better, oh, let's just sober him up. We'll put him in a cold shower. Let's put him in bed. He seems to be fine. But the person could be dead the next day because the alcohol builds up in your system. Okay, overdose remains the leading cause of death for Americans ages 18 to 44. So the rates actually have declined, which is a good thing. As you know, in the news, you always hear about fentanyl and drugs coming over the border and things like that. Unfortunately, it's really hard to stop all that because as long as there's a demand for drugs, drug smugglers find a way to get it into the country, whether it's through the mail or through other ports, things like that. Narcan is a substance, you probably have heard about this. Narcan is a substance and you can use it as a nasal spray, and that can reverse the effects of an overdose. What it does is it blocks the chemical in the drug from taking effect. And so you can save somebody's life by using Narcan. A lot of public places now have Narcan available. So that's been a really great thing to be able to prevent people from dying. Again, as I said earlier, that today's kids are a little less likely to use alcohol. Rates are declining, but more interested in cannabis and psychedelics. Microdosing. Uh, Microdosing is made popular, and this is one of the other things that sometimes can cause problems. Is kids get their news from TikTok, and so if you have a TikTok influencer or YouTuber who's talking about the benefits of microdosing, you use tiny amounts of a psychedelic mushroom, for example, and there is some research that says that it may be helpful for depression. But if you're doing it on your own, you have no idea of how much to use or what some of the negative effects can be, because some people can go on a bad trip, for example, which can be extremely scary. Again, the role of legalization, perceived as safe. So if it's legal at age 18, and in Virginia, for example, if you're 18 and you can get a medical marijuana card pretty easily. But again, the perception is that it is safe. If it's legal, it's going to be safe. And we know that's not the case. So one of the problems with marijuana is that it is much more potent than it was in the 60s and 70s. So you can, with vaping, you can control the percentage of THC in that vape pen. So whereas the percentages of THC in smoking marijuana in the 70s might have been maybe 2, 5, 10% THC concentration, you can get up to 95% concentration of THC. And at that level, that strength, it is far more addictive and can cause far more damage than the marijuana of yours. And some of his parents will say, well, I used a little bit when I was younger. It's not that big of a deal. Well, it can be a very big deal, and it's very difficult for these kids to get off of it. Let's talk a little bit about alcohol use. Alcohol, ethanol or ethyl alcohol, those with chemical terms, it's a depressant drug, okay? So what that means is it depresses the brain functioning. And that's what allows people at lower doses to feel more relaxed, maybe a little bit more friendly, things like that. But at higher doses, what it does is it depresses the control centers of the brain. That's why some people, when they drink, they get more animated. They may even get aggressive, get into fights as a result of alcohol because their control centers are relaxed. The problem with that also is that as you're depressing the activity of the brain, what can happen is if you stop suddenly, if you are a daily drinker and you're drinking large amounts, your brain is used to being suppressed or anesthetized, basically, because alcohol is an anesthetic. And if you stop it suddenly, your brain goes haywire. So you're at higher risk for a seizure. So therefore, for some medications or for some drugs and alcohol in particular, you can't just stop suddenly if you're that addicted to it. So you probably have already, you're familiar with driving under the influence, driving while intoxicated. A level of 0.08 blood alcohol concentration in your blood is considered legally impaired in Virginia, but lower amounts are enough to slow your reaction times, even 0.05. And it only takes generally a couple of drinks to reach 0.08, depending on your body weight. Now, if you're a teenager and you're drinking and driving, because you have less experience as well, you may be affected by even lower doses, which makes it particularly dangerous. There are a couple of different organizations, some apps that you can get on your phone. You can actually get a alcohol droid, allows you to calculate what your blood alcohol likely is. You put in the number of drinks, the concentration, what your body weight is, whether you're male or female, because that also affects how you metabolize alcohol. So these are some ways that kids can use to try to limit their use or try to be more responsible, which is more of a harm reduction model, which we'll talk about it in a little bit. Watch replace your drink. One of the things we're finding, and I've got some patients who have suffered from this as well, if you're at a party with people you don't know or at a bar and you use a date rape drug, you can just dissolve it in somebody's drink without them even knowing it. And I've had some of my patients where they black out and the next thing they know, they're in a bed, they don't recognize where they are, their clothes are off, and they're just left alone. And they realize that they have most likely been sexually assaulted, but they have no memory of it. So you got to be really careful about drinking, and especially when you're around people that you don't know. Talk a little bit about drug abuse. If you want more information on drug use, the National Institute on Drug Abuse has all sorts of resources on their website that you can download, some videos, etc. There are 4 basic categories of drugs. You've got the depressant drugs, which slow you down, calm you down. You've got narcotics, which lower pain. That's where Oxycontin comes into play, morphine, things like that, Vicodin. You've got stimulants, Ritalin and Adderall are legal stimulants because they're used as medications. Cocaine is also a stimulant. Caffeine, but nobody really gets into trouble with caffeine addiction. And hallucinogens. Hallucinogens are things that alter your sense of perception. That's where you go on bad trips. You're hallucinating, which can last hours. So one of the things that I will tell kids in terms of giving them some reasons to think twice about using hallucinogens, for example, something called hallucinogen persisting to perceptual disorder. That is, after you stop using, even if you used a few times, you can have persistent perceptual disturbances, like seeing, and it's a hallucination. It's like seeing snow in front of your face, or lines, or just fuzziness. And that can last for a long time. And we're not really sure if that's a permanent brain damage or just something that's temporary. So you got to be careful about that. Synthetic marijuana. You may have heard of K2 or Spice. Basically, what synthetic marijuana is they'll use basic leaves. It could be oregano, something that sort of looks like marijuana, and you will spray chemicals on it, and then you smoke it. The problem is this is highly dangerous because what you're doing is you're spraying chemicals that are basically poisonous. And so you're getting a high off of that. And again, these are unregulated, so you have no idea what's actually in it. It could be sprinkled with fentanyl for all you know. So that is a very risky thing. So be very careful. And unfortunately, places like, again, vape shops, even gas stations will often sell this kind of stuff. And you see it, oh, it must be safe. It's, in the store, but not at all. Many drugs have multiple effects. Alcohol is one of them, but some of these other things as well. For example, some of the narcotics will, reduce pain. Vicodin is a great medication to reduce pain, but at higher doses, you can hallucinate and you get a high off of it. So it may have different effects there. One of the things about vaping, most parents are concerned about vaping. Unfortunately, vaping is very easy to hide. Your vape pen could be the size of a flash drive. There's even some vaping paraphernalia that can be hidden in the strings of a hoodie. So it just looks like a hoodie and the strings are lying down there. And the teenager during the day can just be sucking on it and actually inhaling various chemicals. So teens who vape are 4.3 times as likely to use marijuana at some point. And recent studies suggest that about 8% of high schoolers vape and 3.5% of middle schoolers. And again, they perceive it as safe because it's legally available. I mean, they're not legal to buy it technically because you have to be 21. But it's not that difficult to find somebody else who will buy it for you. So let me say something about gateway drugs. People will talk about marijuana as being a gateway drug, meaning that if you start using marijuana, you're going to eventually go on to harder drugs. And what research tells us is that most people who use marijuana do not go on to harder drugs. However, most people who go on to harder drugs start with marijuana. That's why you have to take it seriously if your kids are using. CBD. CBD is also part of the cannabis plant where we get marijuana, and that's the psychoactive chemical that makes you get high off of it. CBD is made from hemp, which is related to cannabis, and it's not allowed to have more than, I think, 0.3% THC. People you can get CBD gummies and vapes and you name it. So you can ingest them, you can smoke it, whatever. You can even get it as like a salve that you put on your skin to reduce pain. The problem with CBD, it's not legal everywhere, and it's not regulated. So you have no idea what's really in it. So you may be smoking something that contains CBD and you think it's fine, or ingesting a gummy or whatever. But it may have more than the legal limit of THC in the CBD. And if that's the case and you're using CBD and say your employer tests you for drugs, you may test positive. You said, well, I didn't use it. It's like, well, the CBD could have had higher concentrations. That's one of the problems of a lot of these other things. If they're not regulated and tested regularly, you have no idea. You have no quality control, so you have no idea what's actually in there. Little infographic here. So again, about 90% of addictions start in the teenage years. It's one of the reasons why you want to take it seriously when you see it. I thought this was an interesting statistic at the bottom here as well. 27% of teens and 16% of parents think that using prescription drugs to get high is safer than using street drugs to get high. Now, is that technically true? Yes, if you're using them as prescribed, the prescription drugs are safer. But teenagers who are using prescription drugs are not using them in the recommended doses. And again, they're recommended for people other than the people who are abusing them. All right. Let me just talk a little bit about Virginia marijuana laws. This can be helpful to know, certainly if you're trying to give your teenager some information to make some better choices when it comes to things like this. So again, recreational marijuana and medical marijuana are legal in the state of Virginia. Sales are supposed to be commencing in 2025, but they have not because the state has yet to set up a system to do it legally for recreational use. There are dispensaries where you can go and get it if you have a medical card, and I'll talk about that in just a second. As you can see here, if you're 21 or older, you can purchase recreational marijuana, again, when it becomes available. You can also smoke it in your private residence. And it's legal to possess up to an ounce of cannabis in Virginia. If it's more than a pound and it's in a public place, you can, if you get busted, for example, in your car, that's still considered public, that's considered a felony. Adults can grow up to 4 marijuana plants per household. The key there is if younger kids have easy access to that, that can get you into trouble if you're exposing them to it. This is interesting. Legal to share or transfer up to an ounce of marijuana, but not more. And you can't sell it for money. You may be familiar with a loophole in Washington, D.C., whereas what happens is you go to the store and you buy a trinket. It could be a bracelet, a necklace, or whatever, and you're given the marijuana as a gift. It's a way of getting around the legality of actually selling marijuana. Again, it's easy to get a medical marijuana card, but it needs to be a letter from an MD, medical doctor, physician's assistant, doctor of osteopathy, or nurse practitioner. So one of the things to think about here, if you have a teenager who's 18 and you know that they're using, it may be safer to try to get a medical marijuana card so they don't get busted, so they can get it. The problem with that, of course, is are you condoning the behavior? And that's a tough call to make. And it really depends on what you think is in your teen's best interest and is going to keep them safest and avoid getting in trouble with the law. All right, so let's move on to some non-substance addictions. So there's a couple of statistics here. 50% of teens feel they're addicted to their mobile devices. I suspect it's more than that. 59% of parents think their teens are addicted. You got 66% of parents think that their teens spend too much time on their phones. 80% of teens check their phones at least once an hour, which they can't do now in some of the schools that are limiting it. I think that's a good thing. It allows them to focus more on class. 36% of parents argue with their kids every day about cell phone use. Okay, I suspect the rates are much higher. The other thing interesting with cell phone use as a family issue is when your teen has a cell phone, you expect them to respond immediately if you're trying to check on them, right? And if they don't respond immediately, you figure they're just trying to avoid being in touch with you or letting you know where they are, what they're up to, etc. So on the one hand, we're telling teens, don't use your phones too much. You really need to be interacting with other people. But then if they put their phone aside and they're interacting with friends, they may get into trouble for not actually checking their phones often enough, which makes parents worry, understandably so. So when it comes to behavioral or tech addictions, there's some debate in the scientific community as to whether or not these are true addictions, because activities aren't substances, right? But the activities activate the same brain regions. If you do some studies looking at brain functioning and brain activation, again, the same areas of the brain light up in response to a substance as do when you're using an addictive activity because it brings you so much pleasure. And teens are spending about 9 hours a day on their devices, preteens about 6. One of the important things of thinking of behavioral addictions as true addictions is that the techniques that are used with substance abuse can also help with those addictions. Setting limits on their phone, lowering their use, putting it away for particular periods of time. There are actually apps you can get on phones that will remind you exactly how much time you have been spending on your phone so that you can learn to limit your own use, because a lot of times you don't even realize it. You go down a YouTube wormhole or rabbit hole or whatever. Next thing you know, it's a couple hours later and you haven't done your homework. So here's some signs of smartphone addiction. Feeling you need to respond immediately, constantly checking your phone without notifications. You can even get ghost notifications. And if you keep your phone right on you, you may be thinking that you're getting a notification when you're really not. It's kind of like a ghost notification, but it is a thing that happens. Feeling anxious or depressed when you can't use. Ignoring your environment when you're using. Also, if your use is causing problems, or causes arguments, that's a sign of addiction because of the problems that are going on. If your parents take your phone, you'll do anything to get it back. Grades dropping. So one of the things with ignoring your environment when using, something I want to mention here, is that it's really sad if you go into a restaurant or even you go to a place where teens are kind of congregating and you see everybody looking at their phones and they're not actually interacting with each other. One of the concerns about excessive use of technology here is that kids are losing their social skills. They're not really learning how to interact face to face. They may actually feel safer interacting from a screen, which again has some limitations, because if you're going out into the real world at some point, you have to be able to interact with others in constructive ways. Now, interesting, one of my patients with autism told me recently is that she likes texting because when you're texting, you can include a emoticon, a little picture that labels the tone. So if you're not very good at reading tone with other people and you might react incorrectly, you see the notification that, or the text that includes the tone, and you know how to respond. So there might be some positive aspects of that as well. All right. Video game addiction. So again, 183 million in the US play video games. Now, most teens can stick to reasonable limits, and they do it after they've done their homework, and they do it to relax, have fun, connect with friends, but they're still getting their stuff done. But other people start preferring the virtual world. When you're playing a video game, you can be big and powerful and defeat your enemies and all of that. The problem with that is that it becomes, if you'd rather be in the virtual world as opposed to the real world, obviously that causes problems. These are the teenage boys, for example, who may be in their parents' basements at age 30 playing video games. And you say, oh, I don't want my kids to be doing that. But it is a thing, especially with the economy now where it's even harder to find work. Yeah, it can be a way of communicating with friends. If you overhear your teenage son, for example, in the bedroom and they're laughing and joking and talking while they're playing the game, that's generally a more positive thing, because you don't want to take that away completely. And not everybody's addicted. Maybe about 1 in 10 may be addicted. A lot of kids talk to me about dreams of being a YouTuber. As it turns out, I think there's about 3% of YouTubers that are responsible for about 95% of the content views on YouTube itself. So it's not very realistic. Sort of like thinking that you're going to grow up to be a basketball player or a football player. The number of people who are playing sports that actually go on to play professionally is pretty low, which is not to discourage them, but it's not necessarily realistic. So one of the things to keep in mind also when it comes to video games, and this is true also with social media and phones in general, they're designed to be addictive, okay? Because the more you use, the more money you make. If you're playing Minecraft, Fortnite, or whatever, and you want to buy some additional skins, right? Or whatever things that will enhance the experience, that's how they make money. So you don't want, if you're trying to make money and that's your sole goal in making these games, you don't want kids to be able to put it down. You don't want them to be able to pause in the middle of a game. That's why we often have fights over, hey, put that down, it's time to do this. And they're in the middle of a battle with their friends, and it's really difficult to stop for a lot of these kids. So again, let's repeat, 1 in 10 gamers become addicted. If you have a gaming device in your bedroom, increases your risk of being addicted. So one of the things about violence is that one concern about video games, especially first-person shooter games, is that it may desensitize you to violence. Here too is similar to what I said about marijuana being a gateway drug. Most kids who play these more violent video games do not become violent themselves. They find that it's actually a release. They defeat their enemies, and it actually is a way for them to sort of discharge some of their anger. But what we know about school shooters is they're all obsessed with these violent first-person shooter games. There is one, and I forget which school shooter it was, but they went through his video game history and whatnot and found out that he had actually, over the course of his lifetime, executed about 85,000 kills by shooting people, shooting the characters in the head. So if you're doing that to that extent, doing it to an actual person, there's not as much of a leap. So that is something to keep in mind. I've already mentioned about loss of in real life social skills is a concern about gaming, especially if your child is doing it solo and not interacting with anybody at all. Can cause sleep disturbance. You know, we know kids often are in the middle of the night. Some kids are so addicted, even if their parents lock up their game systems, when the parents are asleep, the kids will find it and then use it in the middle of the night and then can't get up for school. We know that increased irritability and depression can occur with excessive gaming. So, and often the irritability occurs when you're not actually engaged in it. Lower physical activity, poor health outcomes. So one of the concerns about gaming is that if you're gaming in something that's really exciting, it actually gets your blood pumping, gets your fight or flight mechanism activated, but there's no physical release. So after you're done with the game, you're revved up, which makes it harder to fall asleep. And also, if you're busy playing video games, you're not going outside and doing some things that are more physically active, which is partly why we have, increasing rates of obesity in the country and actually across the world. One of the things is about video games in general, there are some cultures, Japan being one of them, South Korea another, where they actually have residential treatment centers for kids who are addicted to gaming. And some of these countries are actually passing laws keeping kids from being on games after a certain amount, or limiting the number of hours they can be on the games, because it's become that much of a problem in some countries. So let me talk about some risk factors for addiction. So having a family member who abuses drugs or alcohol can be a risk factor because there's a genetic component. There's some people, for example, I think there's some cultures or some races who are less likely to become addicted to certain things because of the way their brains process it. So not everybody is at risk for addiction. But if you have a family history, if there's multiple people in your family who are alcoholics or abusing drugs or whatnot, that can be a reason to share. That can be something you share with your kids to say, hey, listen, it's running in the family, so you're at higher risk. If you choose not to use at all, you're not going to develop an addiction, right? So, but if you start using, your chances of getting addicted are higher. Now, some of that might also be just observation. If teenagers have a parent who is using marijuana, it's easier for the kids to, number one, get access to it, and two, think it's okay. Having mental health problems. So if you have anxiety, depression, ADHD, things like that, things that make it harder for you to function, that increases your risk for addiction, because if you use a substance that makes you feel better temporarily, you're more inclined to want to keep using that substance, even if it's causing problems. Having friends who use. It is really hard to be the only kid who is not using if all your friends are using. So if you see your kids changing friend groups and you know most of their friends are using alcohol or drugs, you have to be more concerned, because it is a higher likelihood. Again, not always. I've had some teenagers who were the designated drivers for their friends, and they were very proud of that role. So, I don't want my friends to have trouble, so I will be the one to drive, and I'm not going to drink as a result, unless I'm staying overnight with friends, in which case that could be a different situation where it's not as risky. Doing poorly in school. Again, if you think of self-medicating, if you're not doing well in school and you feel like you're a failure because you're not doing well in school, but using a substance makes you feel better, again, at least temporarily. If there's a lot of conflict going on in the family, the risk is higher, again, as a way of trying to deal with emotional pain, if you will. Having been physically or sexually abused, research says that people who've had those traumas are more likely to use, again, as a way of trying, in this case, a way of maybe getting away from recollections of the trauma, because you're not thinking about it when you're high. The type of drug and how you administer it, okay? So smoking, for example, gets into your system faster than consuming it. Snorting something gets into your system very quickly. So if you're using a substance that gets in your system very quickly and you have instant relief, that increases the risk for addiction. Injecting it, of course, is one of the highest risk factors there because of how quick it gets in your system immediately. So pros and cons of sharing your own history. Parents will have asked me that as well. Should you share if you're concerned about your teenager's use, should you share that you've used before, whether it's drugs, alcohol, or other things? And again, I think it really depends. Yeah. If some parents are concerned, like if you say, oh, well, I used marijuana when I was your age, that's somehow condoning it. But I think if you do it in a factual, sort of non-judgmental way to say, listen, I did use marijuana as a teenager, yeah, and I really liked it, but then it started affecting my grades and I got into trouble. That can be useful for a child to know, to say, this is something that maybe you could prevent. And maybe they're more likely to come to you if you share some of that with them. So that's something to think about. We've already talked about marijuana as a gateway and CBD, so let's just move on. Let me talk about some negative consequences of addiction. Okay, these are a number of negative outcomes that can occur as a result of addiction. These are primarily physical right now in terms of the effects, negative consequences of drugs and alcohol, but some of these clearly are also applicable to behavioral addictions. Memory impairment or loss. So one of the things we know about marijuana in particular, marijuana affects the hippocampus, which is the part of your brain that's involved in storing memories. So if it limits your short-term memory, you're going to do worse in school because you can't remember. If you're somebody with ADHD and you already have trouble staying focused and remembering things, the marijuana use can make it even worse. And one of the things we know is that the earlier you start, the more likely you are to have problems. And so when a teenager's brain is still developing, the last thing you want them to do is use a substance to the effect that it affects their brain functioning. We'll talk about that more in just a little bit. Lower grades and lower occupational achievement. Okay. So if you're addicted to something and it's causing you not to focus on your studies, you don't necessarily want to get a job. And if you get a job that requires a drug test, you say, I can't apply to that job because I'm not willing to stop. So those people are going to have lower occupational achievement and may never be able to be fully independent. It is always a possibility. Damage to your heart, lungs, brain, etc. So, for example, if you're using excessive alcohol and your brain has a seizures, which is excessive electrical activity in the brain, can cause damage. Obviously, the lungs can be damaged as a result of smoking. When you have 19-year-old kids telling me that they can't even ride their bike anymore because they get winded because of smoking, that actually can be a motivator to stop. But some of these things can happen pretty early on in your use. Stimulants in particular are damaging to your heart because when you use a stimulant, whether it's cocaine or excessive amounts of like Adderall or Ritalin, because teenagers like using it because they'll keep them all up all night and they can get their studies done. But it has some negative effects as well. It raises your blood pressure, it puts strain on the heart, so increases your risk of a stroke, for example. And there are some reports of young people having strokes as a result of their use of stimulants. Obviously, overdose, paralysis. If you have a stroke at a young age, it could paralyze part of your body. And that may be permanent. And obviously, death is a huge negative consequence. Legal problems. This is one of the things that you have to think about also as parents, and I'll talk more about this in a minute. You don't want your kids to get into legal problems because then the law gets involved. You may have to go to court. There may be fines. There may be required treatment, things like that. But if you have a permanent record, especially if you're charged as an adult, that can affect your future employment. There's certain jobs you will not ever be able to have if you have a record like that. It's not always possible to get those things expunged. When you're younger, it's more likely that that would happen. Job loss due to unreliability. If you don't show up to work regularly because you're recovering from the effects of getting high the night before and you can't get up in the morning, yeah, you're going to lose your job. Harms relationships, higher rates of divorce. It's very difficult to have a functional relationship if one of the persons is addicted to drugs or alcohol. Even worse if it's both. So are there positive consequences of addiction? There can be some positive consequences of use. Okay, if you're using on occasion with friends and you're having a good time and it brings you closer, but it's not the main way that you socialize, that could possibly be a positive consequence. Uh, if you are suicidally depressed and you're using a drug that makes you feel better and it keeps you from killing yourself, that could be a positive consequence. But again, that's usually the short term. It might help in the short term or seem to help, but the longer you use, the more likely these negative consequences will occur. Which brain do you want? So let me just describe this quickly. I have this in my office, and I will show it to teenagers who are considering using use. These are SPECT images that basically measures the amount of glucose your brain is using uh, at any given moment. And so one of the things we see when it's filled in like this at the top, that basically is a healthy brain. It means that the brain is working pretty well. There's a lot of activity going on. With extensive use of drugs, you can see 3 years of use of methamphetamine, 10 years of alcohol use towards the left there, cocaine, opiates, things like that, 4 years of marijuana use, even at age 17. Those holes are not literal holes in the brain. What it is lower activity. So when you have lower activity in the brain, you can't use it to the same extent that you would otherwise. This is one of the reasons why people who are addicted have trouble functioning on the job, have trouble functioning at school, because they're just not able to use their full brain capacity. Um, this looks a little scary, and sometimes that can make some of the teenagers I work with say, well, I don't want that kind of brain, And I says, we don't know that it goes back. For some people, if you stop using, especially early on, your brain can repair itself. But one of the issues, especially for teenagers, and this is an example to think about that you could also share, is if you spend all of your teenage years when your brain is developing using marijuana, then your brain develops expecting that chemical to be there. So if you decide that you want to stop at age 21, 22, 23, your brain's going to be in withdrawal. It's not going to know what to do. And so you may have much more difficulty stopping if you are using throughout your teenage years because your brain develops under that influence. That's why I tell teenagers, the less you use and the longer you wait to use, the less likely you are to be addicted. If you start using a drug or even just smoking marijuana at age 24, 25, your brain's already fully formed pretty much. So it's not going to have the same impact on you. So that can be a reason to get them to slow down their use. All right, here's some warning signs of addiction. Uh, and there's a lot of stuff online if you are at all concerned, because sometimes parents are the last to know. But if you suspect it at all, keep your eyes open. Red eyes, use of eye drops. Some drugs, marijuana in particular, can make your eyes bloodshot. So if you're using eye drops, it hides that. But most teenagers are not going to be using eye drops. So you have to say, why is this bottle there? What are they hiding? Skipping class or school. A lot of times they'll skip to go get high with their buddies. A drop in grades, again, a change in their academic performance, a change in friend group. If all of a sudden there's hanging around a bunch of people that you don't know at all, that can be a warning sign. Lying or stealing, more secretive. If you are using drugs and you need money, they may steal from you. You may find money going missing from your wallet, etc. Irritability or anger. And often, again, that could be under the influence or it could be when it's wearing off. If your child is using marijuana, for example, and they come home to you and then it's wearing off, they may be more irritable and angry as it's wearing off. A loss of interest in other activities. People who give up, involvement in clubs or sports or things like that. They just don't find them fun anymore. Because one of the problems with drugs and alcohol, and other addictions is that real life can't really compare. So one of the things that, for example, dopamine was one of the chemicals in the brain that makes you feel pleasure. If you have a drug that boosts your level of dopamine by, say, a factor of 10, you're going to feel on top of the world when you have that. And real life can't compare to it. So what you actually are ending up doing is you're destroying your ability to enjoy life on life's terms. That is one of the biggest risks of addiction. Here's some more warning signs: a change in sleep habits, sleeping too much or too little. Again, financial issues, missing money or items, or suddenly having more money. And I hear this as well. It's like all of a sudden he's coming home with, new shirts and things and he's not working. Where's this money coming from? One of the problems with selling drugs, for example, and a lot of students who have sold at some point is, again, it's easy money. And it also makes you feel important. if you're the go-to guy or girl at school for drug use, and you can provide to other people, it's a great way to become popular. But obviously, there's lots of risks associated with that. Physical symptoms: nausea, vomiting, headaches. Actually, some of the higher doses of THC can actually induce vomiting. And a lot of times they don't make that connection, but it can make you vomit at higher doses. Neglecting hygiene, you're all of a sudden not showering anymore. If you find paraphernalia, spoons, clips, pipes, baggies used to sell, for example. Here's a link that you can check out later if you want to kind of look at how to identify drug paraphernalia, what to look for in terms of the clips, the bongs, the smoking devices. Certainly the vaping devices are pretty easy to identify these days. This is just a little graphic to give you some other things that you can look at. I'll just point out a couple things here under the skin. People wearing long sleeves in warm weather. And again, if that's a change, they may be hiding marks on their skin that are that may be caused by injecting drugs, for example. Right. So let me get down to diagnosing addictive disorders. Okay. So these are some of the things we look at to see if somebody meets the criteria for addiction. Continue to use it after it causes or exacerbates physical, social, academic, or emotional problems. A loss of control over your use, and that's a key part. If you decide that you're going to have a couple of drinks with friends and that's it, and you know when to stop, you're in control of your use. On the other hand, somebody with addiction, they may have a couple of drinks and then all of a sudden they want more. So it almost like it turns on cravings, so they can't reliably control how much, despite their best attempts to limit it. Problems with family and friends as a result, certainly. Using when risky or dangerous, driving under the influence. And it's not just alcohol. Marijuana also slows your reaction times. So that is also risky. That is actually an incentive that you can use with your teenagers. That if you say, hey, listen, I know that you're smoking marijuana regularly, and I know that it reduces reaction time. So I can't legally allow you to drive if I know that you're under the influence. So on the other hand, if you are willing to stop and can prove it through drug tests, for example, yeah, then I'd be okay with you driving. And sometimes if you have a child that wants to drive bad enough, sometimes that can be enough. So signs of tolerance, that's needing more to achieve the same effect or withdrawal. Alcohol is one that can be like that. Marijuana can be like that. Sometimes the stimulants, where again, what happens in the brain is that your brain gets particularly good at metabolizing it. So then it kind of neutralizes it sooner. So you need more to achieve that same effect. One of the problems with tolerance is that, for example, with alcohol, if you have a high tolerance for it, it may take 5 or 6 drinks to really get drunk. Whereas for other people, it only takes 1 or 2. And even though somebody may look like they're functioning after 5 drinks and they're still walking around where other people would be on the floor, some of the other problems associated with the alcohol use, some of the side effects, if you will, continue to build. So even though you may look fine because you need a higher level to get that same effect, your response time, your reaction times are still going to be slow. You're still going to be a danger behind the wheel. Withdrawal means that you have symptoms that occur if you suddenly stop. So nicotine is a good example of that, is that nicotine is a drug that you administer multiple times a day. And it only takes often 30 to 60 minutes to start going into withdrawal. You get a little jittery, a little anxious, and then you have another cigarette and you feel better for a little while, but you need to keep doing that. Alcohol withdrawal can be a thing. Marijuana withdrawal can be a thing. Like I said, if you have somebody who's trying to stop marijuana use and they're all of a sudden having trouble sleeping, that could be the reason, because the marijuana was helping them sleep, and now they don't have that in their system, and it takes time for the brain to readjust. So one of the things, let me just back up a little bit here, with painkillers, again, like Vicodin, Oxycontin, both being pretty big ones, that when you have a painkiller in your system, your brain stops producing the natural chemicals that it usually produces to keep your pain in check. So when you stop suddenly, the pain is unbearable for a lot of people if they're addicted to a painkiller. So one of the things we know is that it's much safer to gradually reduce the use That gives your brain a chance to sort of recover. Because your brain's pretty smart. You know, if you're getting a chemical externally that mimics or imitates one of your natural chemicals, your brain just stops producing it, thinking, okay, we don't need to produce as much because we got plenty running through the system. That's part of what happens in withdrawal. Here's some other symptoms to look for: using larger amounts or over a longer period of time than you planned, not being able to stop or cut down, spending a lot of time getting the drugs or using the substance or recovering from its effects. That's when it really starts interfering with your ability to function at school and work, etc. Having strong cravings to keep using. So one of the things we know about cravings is that once your brain starts associating drug use with different situations and you stop using the drug, when you're around those same situations, your brain can actually create cravings. That's because it's what they associate with the drug. Sort of like if you open the cabinet for a dog and the dog starts salivating because the dog knows that the food is coming. Your brain does the same thing when it comes to drugs and alcohol. So you start having that craving, you start getting ready for it, for you to use it, even before you even ingest the substance, because your brain expects it. So and cravings are really difficult for a lot of people because their risk of relapse is going to be higher when they're having cravings. And again, failing to meet your responsibilities. So here are some treatment options. We've got self-help groups, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Smart Recovery, which is an alternative. There are some groups that are specific to teenagers in the area. Some of the schools run groups as well. So sometimes if you can get in with other people who are also struggling, you might be able to have more motivation to quit. That's the idea behind these self-help groups. And that's cheap, it's free, it's the easiest thing to gain access to. Individual or family therapy can also be helpful. You know, as a substance use counselor, one of the things I always want to know is what's prompting the use? What needs are being fulfilled by the use of the drug? And how can we figure out ways to get those needs met in other ways? Group therapy, a lot of substance abuse therapy is in groups because, again, if you're around other people who also know what it's like to have a problem, you're going to feel more understood and less judged. And it might make it easier to recover as a result. And you can also get support from those people. If you're having trouble, they may be able to give you some suggestions. Intensive outpatient therapy is usually meeting maybe 2-3 hours, maybe 2 or 3 times a week. And again, it's almost always group therapy where you're getting more intensive work. And obviously, when you're in the therapy group, you're not going to be using that time to go out and get high. So it can take up some of your time. Day treatment or partial hospitalization, that means that you go to the program that a hospital has and you're there all day, but you don't stay overnight. That's day treatment or partial hospitalization. Sometimes that can be helpful if you don't really need to be there overnight. It's also a little bit cheaper. A step down, meaning that you might be hospitalized first, and then rather than just release you back to the community, you go one step down to just doing day treatment, and then you can stay at home. So one of the things in terms of deciding which of these is most appropriate is you want to evaluate how severe is the problem. Milder problems may benefit from self-help or individual therapy. More severe problems may benefit from group therapy, day treatment. More severe problems, especially if there's some medical risk of stopping, you're going to have hospitalization as your safest approach. Certainly if you've overdosed. Residential treatment is the most restrictive here. And for people who are not getting better through these other options, residential treatment can be very helpful because it's 3 to 6 months usually, and that gives you a longer time to recover. If you're somebody who is severely addicted, having just a few weeks at a hospital just may not be enough. By the time your brain clears to actually be able to use the information you're learning, it may be time to be discharged. So the other advantage of residential treatment is it gets you away from your home situation, from your friends. And if you're having a hard time stopping use because all your friends are using, this gives you a break from that and allows you a better chance of trying to get better. All right. So let me talk about some treatment strategies. These are some of the things that we will do in therapy to try to help kids recover from their use. And these are some things that you can also learn how to help them with. So relapse prevention is the biggest thing. When somebody stops using, you want to prevent relapse. You want to prevent them from going back to the drug or alcohol use. And that can be difficult because there are a lot of temptations. And so usually we try to come up with a plan. So it may be not being around your old friends. It could be um, going to a support group meeting. It could be keeping some things with you that always remind you of why you're trying to stop. You know, let's say you were traumatized by something, and maybe uh, say one of your friends died from an overdose, and you carry your friend's picture with you. When you're tempted to use, you look at your friend's picture, and that could be enough to say, okay, I don't want to go. I don't want that to happen to me. Or keeping pictures of your friends and family close. Say, okay, I really want to put my family through this again? That can be useful for some people. In addiction treatment, we talk about people, places, and things. Those are your risk factors. Being around people who are using, being in places where you used to use, and things, objects that are associated with your use. So any of those things can be. You have to keep an eye on those and try to prevent yourself from being exposed to those. That's why you may need to change your friend group, for example, which is really hard for a lot of people. For teenagers, that could be the hardest because if all their friends are drug users and you say the only way I can stop is just not to be around them, you know, it's a tough choice for them to make. Sometimes we can encourage them to go back to maybe some friendships that they had sort of left behind. Um, and so maybe revisiting some of those friendships can be useful. Hungry, angry, lonely, tired, those are those are just relapse triggers, potential relapse triggers. So it's important to make sure that you eat properly. That if you're getting angry, to have like a physical release for that. If you're lonely, have people you can spend time with, and making sure you get enough sleep. All those things lower your risk of relapse. Learning to identify pro-addiction versus pro-recovery thoughts. So pro-addiction is, I'll just use one time. This time I'm going to control it. It's not a big deal. Those are pro-addiction thoughts. Those are thoughts that you have that promote addiction. Versus pro-recovery thoughts might be, hey, listen, I just got back onto the team. I don't want to get kicked off again by using. So let's just put it off till tomorrow. I'm not gonna use today. That could be a pro-recovery thought. Or, hey, I really want to go to college, and I know this has gotten in the way of my studies, so I'm gonna focus on that goal. When you're having those kinds of thoughts, those can promote recovery. One of the most important things is finding healthy substitutes. That if you look at drug use or alcohol use or any addictive activity, it's serving some sort of need, right? Whether it's for relieving boredom, getting excited, having fun, being with friends. Um, if you have to find healthy substitutes. So a lot of times with addiction, you give up your hobbies. You don't want to be in clubs. You may stop. You may quit being in sports just because they get in the way of your addiction. So if you get back to some of those healthier substitutes, your chances of relapse are lower. Considering your friend group, I've already talked about. Develop healthier coping strategies to deal with stress, emotions, and life in general. And that's where I find therapy can be very useful. That with that it is hard to manage your emotions. It's easy to get overwhelmed by them. As adults, we struggle with it as well. Kids struggle with it even more. And so if we can help kids to learn how to, using some deep breathing, some meditation, maybe it's aromatherapy where they have some scents that calm them down, taking a warm bath, going for a walk, um, maybe playing a board game with somebody at school, different things that they can do when they're feeling overwhelmed with something. So if they can learn how to manage their emotions in life in healthier ways, then they're less likely to need to resort to a substance. Drug testing can also be very useful. There are plenty of over-the-counter drug testing kits you can get. There are also physicians who will write a prescription for you if you want to go to a formal lab, especially for some of the more serious addiction problems. Sometimes drug testing can be part of treatment, especially if they agree to it. For example, if they're out with friends and they're tempted to get high, they could say, "Hey, my parents drug test me. If they drug test me, they're going to take my car again, and I don't want that to happen, so I'm not going to use." So drug testing kind of keeps you honest, but also gives teenagers an out, an excuse, if you will, not to use. And that can be very useful, especially when teenagers realize, "Hey, this will help me." So let me talk a little bit about harm reduction. Harm reduction approach is one of the approaches that is pretty popular these days. And one of the things we know is the just say no approach was a failure. The DARE program really didn't do a whole lot. There used to be ads on TV. This is your brain on drugs. They had a little egg that was frying in a pan. Well, teenagers know that's not really what it is. It didn't really help at all. So the harm reduction approach is not condoning use or encouraging it. It's basically saying, as I see here, if you're going to use, here are some ways to do it safely. And empowering teens to make their own decisions. Because if you take the decision-making ability away from a teenager and they're rebellious, they're going to fight that. But if you help them make decisions to slow it down, to stop, to reduce their use, to take a break. You probably heard of like sober or dry Januaries where people try to go a month without using. And sometimes that could be a way of reducing harm. Say, give it a try. If you can go for a month without using, maybe it wasn't so much of a problem. But if they can't even go a few days, that could be a sign, okay, obviously I have a problem here. So I'm always telling teenagers, it's the safest approach is just not to use. But if you're going to choose to use less often in smaller amounts, certainly never alone with more dangerous drugs. And again, telling them the longer you wait to use, the less likely you are to become addicted. So your involvement as parents is really key to recovery here, okay? Because addiction is a family disease. Everybody is affected in some way. If you have to spend a lot more time and energy, for example, dealing with the child with an addiction, the other kids may become resentful of that, for example. If you're living at home, marriage or a partner, you may fight over how to deal with the addicted teenager, and that can cause problems. So it's really important to strengthen your relationship with your teen with healthy communication to really get them to be able to talk to you. And you want to try to be open, respectful, non-judgmental, and assertive. So in other words, you don't want to put them down and make them feel bad, but you also want to make it clear, you're not welcome to use drugs in my house. These are some things that you can do to minimize your use. And that's hard because you want to listen to what they're telling you without overreacting. And if you're scared to death when you find out that your teenager is, shooting up drugs, for example, that again, it's hard to do. One of the biggest problems in terms of parental involvement is, do you punish them for honesty? Let's say they come to you and say, hey, I was at a party and I actually ended up getting high with my friends. If you as a parent say, hey, well, thanks for telling me, and no, you can't go to any more parties now. What's going to happen? They're going to lie to you. And if they lie to you about that, they're actually at greater risk. So as hard as it may be, you need to not overreact. So you need to be able to have a discussion with them so that, again, if you can put some limits on what they're doing, that make it less likely for them to use or less likely to get in trouble. That could be. Now, again, with some drugs that are so dangerous, you may not be able to do that at all. If you have somebody who's using fentanyl, for example, you're not going to teach them how to use fentanyl safely because it is such a high risk for addiction. And when you have something like that, getting more intensive treatment right from the start may be the safest thing to do. So one of the things that we use with teenagers and actually adults as well in terms of treatment is called motivational interviewing. And what motivational interviewing basically does is tries to build incentive or help strengthen a voice to not use, to make a choice not to use. And the way that you do that is by asking questions. Why did you start using? What are some of the good things about your addiction? It's always good to start there with teenagers because that way you can get a better sense of why they're doing it. Because if you understand why, it's easier to figure out, okay, what do we need to do to stop this? And what are some of the not so good things? What makes you think you might need to make a change? And maybe you have a teenager who really wants to go to college, but realizes the grades aren't going to get them there. So what might happen if you choose to change? What might happen if you choose not to change? How confident are you that you can do it if you try? What's the best or worst thing to happen if you quit? Hear that none of these are judgmental, okay? And the key with this, why this can be so helpful, is teenagers are likely to tell you more if you come across as non-judgmental and respect their reasons and try your hardest to understand it from their point of view. And if you've heard them, they're more likely to hear you. And another way that you can do this that I think works really well is you can say, well, what do you think I'm going to tell you? What do you think my opinion is about this? And let them verbalize it as opposed to you saying it. And they say, okay, well, so you think I'm going to throw my life away if I do this, this, and this? Yeah. What do you think? What would you think that what can I do to help you to not use, to make a different decision here? You know, is there an incentive I can use? There's actually there's some research that says that paying people to not use drugs actually sometimes works. So it's important to encourage positive behavior, focusing on the good. You don't want to make everything about the drug use or the activity use. You want to build their self-esteem, because when you feel better about yourself, you feel more confident and more motivated to make changes. You want to participate in therapy, and that can be tricky as well. That if your child is in individual or group therapy, you're not necessarily going to know every time they share that they're using. And that can be tricky, because if the therapist immediately violates their confidentiality, the teenagers are not going to tell you what's going on. So usually what I'll do is I will talk about that. Okay, we'll say, hey, if you use marijuana with your friends on the weekends sometimes, and it doesn't seem to be causing huge problems, that's not something I have to share. If you tell me that you were drinking and then you went driving, that's crossing the line. So this is something we need to tell your parents about. Would you like to be the one to tell them, or would you like me to tell them? And I will encourage them to be able to talk to their parents about it. And that's hard, but that's one of the lines that you draw. That's why it's so important to be honest with kids about the limits of confidentiality. Sometimes they don't want to really share things in school because the counselor might say, "Oh, yeah, it's going to be fine. I don't have to. This is all private." And then, "Oh, you told me this. I'm now required to tell your parents." So again, you want to strive to be firm, not angry. Lectures and yelling don't help. Yeah, you're gonna need some tighter parenting. You need to pay close attention to keep them safe. So, you know, normally you might say to your teenager, "Hey, I don't go in your room searching because I want to respect your privacy." But if they're using drugs or things that are dangerous, they may lose that privilege of privacy until such time as they can earn it back, because you're trying to keep them safe. Again, if you can involve your teen in the process and collaborate and come up with some strategies, that can be very, very helpful. And the advantage of this as well, when you're being firm but not angry, being respectful towards your teens, if they do get into trouble, they're more likely to come to you. And that's what you want them to be able to do. So one of the things you have to be careful here is you want to set clear boundaries, what you will and will not do. I have parents who will say, "Hey, I'm not gonna bail you out of jail if you get in trouble with the law for drug use. I'm not gonna do it." So you need to know that now when you're trying to make a decision. Be careful that you're not enabling your child by making it too easy for them to use. Are you willing to lie for them because you don't want them to get in trouble? That could put them at higher risk later. You know, how many of your own needs are you going to sacrifice by helping your teenager, not getting sleep and spending all of your money and time trying to get them help? And that's a tough one as well. Will you pay for their attorney fees if they get arrested? I have kids who are now finally sober. They're still paying their parents back because of the attorney fees. They said, "No, I'm not going to enable you that way." You know, what level of use, if any, are you willing to accept? So again, that can be tough. If they're having a couple of drinks with friends, are you willing to accept that and not take further action? And are you willing to involve the legal system? So one of the things for you to think about is, again, how much danger you think your child is in. Sometimes the only way that you can get them help, because you feel like you've lost total control, is to involve the legal system. You can make a report to the juvenile probation, child in need of supervision. You might be able to get them to be court ordered for therapy. And if you're on probation because of your drug use, the probation officer will drug test you. The advantage of that is that they're answering to an authority higher than yourself, if you will. The disadvantage is that you lose some of your decision-making ability when you do that. So I look at it again, how risky is their behavior? You know, if they're overdosing, you know, every other day, I don't care. I'd want them to be safe. At least in jail, I think they're going to be safe. So again, this is very difficult stuff. It is hard. That's why a lot of therapists don't do addictions. But you have to take care of yourself as well. Again, participate in therapy. Don't be afraid to ask for some private sessions if you need, so you can just vent and seek some guidance. Making sure you have some time for exercise. If you need support, Families Anonymous is a great resource. They have their self-help group for parents and other people who have people with addictions in their lives, whether it's kids or partners, things like that. Reducing stress in other parts of your life, if you can. That's easier said than done, I know. But you have to try to be at your best as much as possible. And let go of blame. You know, be careful about blaming yourself. You're not the only influence on your kids. So, all right. So addiction is a serious problem. You know, the rates go up and down. Most people relapse and not everyone gets better. So you have to, relapse doesn't mean failure. Usually relapse means, okay, there's something missing in our recovery plan. What do we learn from the relapse? Okay. Parenting is intensely difficult, as I said. Treatment may be long term. This is not like an overnight cure by any means. Again, you have to balance their needs with the needs of you and the rest of your family. It's okay to, set some limits on that because the other members of your family also need attention. And there is hope. We do have treatment strategies that work. If you can get kids to buy into it and you work with them over the long term, most of the kids we see do end up doing much better once they get through it. It's like being on a roller coaster. You got to hold on to the reins. But again, keep your relationship positive as much as you can with your kids. One of the things I often tell parents in all the talks that I give is that as kids get older, your source of authority switches from telling them what to do to selling them on the right thing to do. And the way that you do that is through your relationship. And so if you have a positive relationship with your kids, you are more likely to be able to have a positive influence on them because they want to please you. They don't want to risk that relationship either. If your relationship with your teen is so conflictual and so toxic, they don't care what you want. If anything, they're going to try to defy you because they don't care about your feelings. And then you're in much bigger danger. So, okay, well, that is the end of the talk. I hope you learned some useful information. Again,